item tonight is a presentation and discussion of future event traffic control options. It's going to be led by, I think, the Honorable Chief Dennis Kohlmeyer. And for people in attendance or watching at home, you may recall back, I think it was January 13th, at that board meeting or workshop, we said that we would come back by March 24th with what options have been researched on this. And, well, Chief,
hello.
You're a man of your word.
Try to be.
So I'll hand it the time to you.
First of all, when we had that initial discussion in January, we identified that there's three general categories that we're going to try to research in. Those categories were the paid peace officer, paid non-peace officer, and volunteer non-peace officer. Before we tried to find the right solution, we wanted to clearly identify what we were actually trying to accomplish. So one of the first steps we took was to go through the activity of the Special Police and look at what a calendar year would look like from an events perspective to see what type of services we were providing. So as you see on the screen here in the handouts, this is a list of the annual details that the Special Police conducted. We tried to identify the length of the detail, the frequency, and number of days to give us a total hours per event. We then categorized, with the help of the committee from the former Special Police, to identify what resources they would assign to these details and then come up with projected hours. So really what that did for us is it gave us a good idea of what services we were trying to maintain moving forward with whatever solution we ended up identifying. The only kind of caveat is down at the bottom. There's three categories for emergency call-ins. Those are annual details. Those are very situational. So there's some years where those numbers will probably be hit, and there's other years where they may not, or there may be years that they're exceeded. So that's kind of a ballpark based on experience over the last 20 years or so of what a typical year might entail. So we ended up with a total hour commitment from the Special Police to be just under $1,300 there, $1,293. So that gave us an idea of what we were looking to accomplish. So like I said, we looked at peace officers that are paid employees that are non-peace officers, and volunteer peace officers. And we went through an option analysis to try to identify what requirements would come with each option and what were the pros and cons of those options. So starting at the top with the paid peace officer, as we know from our previous discussion, New York State doesn't allow volunteer peace officers, so that is the only option for the peace officer category. With that comes the powers of arrest, the use of force, non-lethal weapons, all of the power and authority that comes with the peace officer's position. One of the discussion points with that level of authority is whether that is what the board desires in the unit that gets created, whether they are looking to have a supplemental body of employees that have the power of arrest outside of the police department, or under the police department outside of the police officers. Because of the duties and responsibilities that come with that position, we felt it would be appropriate to have a full law enforcement uniform. Some of the pros of having that level of position is that compared to our previous discussion, they are covered by workman's comp because they're employees. It might aid in recruitment and retention because of the interest in that type of position. It would allow the town to have a broad scope of services, and training is highlighted on both the pros and cons because with additional power and responsibility comes an increased level of training. So that amount of training that the Special Police go through, that's a benefit. Some of the negatives that come with that option are the cost. As we saw historically, the Special Police attended an academy. We talked about the academy hours now being elevated to 190 hours for the onboarding, so that's not annual, that's to obtain the peace officer certification. With that comes the cost of paying them to attend the training. So previously they were attending that as volunteers to get their certification, and they paid for that. We'll get to a cost analysis in a couple minutes. So that cost would cover the personnel, the training, and equipment associated with that option. One of the other cons is risk. So with powers of arrest and having the ability to use force, that obviously elevates the risk and potential activities that the paid peace officers would be involved in. One of the cons is civil service limitations. There's only 2 active civil service titles that allow for paid peace officers. One of them is a part-time police officer, and the other one is a special patrol officer. The special patrol officer is limited to people who are retired peace or police officers appointed from a competitive civil service list. So that would not include any of our former special police officers. So the civil service limitations there, even if we went with the paid peace officer options, basically limits you to retired police officers moving forward. There's a potential for grievances, not having negotiated yet with the union on the impact of having other paid law enforcement entities in the town. And again, the training commitment is 190 hours. For the paid non-peace officers, the level of authority is really to be determined. Initial discussion is about the power and authority of a flag person, similar to other traffic control devices. Since our last meeting, we'll do some research that doesn't appear to be so much of a feasible option. The vehicle traffic law pretty specifically defines what a flag person is, and it limits that to construction sites, railroad crossings, and escort vehicles. So really the authority to achieve the services we're looking for is something that has to continue to be investigated to try to identify. For uniform, we felt they wouldn't need a full law enforcement uniform. Having something with high visibility and at least enough to convey the minimum level of authority that they're being given by the town. It would also allow them to be covered by workman's comp, and it has a reduced training commitment from the peace officer position. Some of the cons are, again, civil service limitations. The civil service limitations aren't only entitled, there is no current title that would fit this appropriate level of authority the town wants to convey, so there has to be something that's created. In addition to that, when it comes to hiring and terminating services, you end up with the protections of civil service for the employees, so it becomes a contested competitive position that you have to go through that entire process. For the volunteer non-peace officer, again, it has the same question on authority. It's pretty similar to the paid non-peace officer position because there would be no expectation of powers of arrest or anything to do with interaction with traffic control. So a visible clothing to provide safety and minimal authority to convey their position in the town. Again, reduced training, and another benefit potentially would be lower barrier to entry. By being able to appoint people and have people transition a little bit quicker, and potentially allow more people to participate in this public events unit. Some of the cons, it has the same concern we had with the former special police, that because they're volunteers, there is no loss of wage protection. So any injury they sustained on their duty for or services for the town would be covered for the medical treatment, but it wouldn't allow for the loss of wage compensation, similar to the discussion we had in January. And then recruitment and retention, it may be difficult to attract people and retain them in a position where they may not feel they have the status or authority that comes with what we previously had. And part of the discussion we had is if you look to the right, each one of those arrows that goes up kind of increases as you go from option 3 to option 1. And there's different levels to each option. And really, the thought process here is that as we increase up with power and authority, you potentially have the ability to deliver more services. The training requirements increase. The cost increases in order to provide those services. And the risk increases based on the duties they may be performing. And ultimately what we want to do is be able to push all of those to an appropriate level that allows us to provide the value that we had or increase the value that we were previously providing. And really, in my opinion, it's up to the board to decide what level of services based on the amount of training, based on the cost analysis, and the level of risk adversity that the board has based on the services that we provide. So I guess the intent there of that graphic is to allow you to picture that as you select up the options, each one of those is probably going to increase to the final level you're comfortable with. So our next step was try to identify what the cost of those options would be. So we went through an exercise where we talked through as a group using Director Connor to help with the human resources aspect, and the group as a whole to come up with what would the appropriate categories would be here in dollar amounts. So if you start with the upper left, you have the titles that we talked about, and we put what we would expect to be the compensation, an hourly rate for those services. And the members box was a projected 15-member organization based on the current staffing of the former Special Police, what that amount was. And as you look at it, the colors associated with the titles. So the top one is the paid peace officer, the initial training, and so we try to break it out based on initial training and annual recurring costs. So for the initial, you have 190 hours at the $25 an hour to give you a subtotal of the $47.50. We anticipate about 16 hours of annual training in order to keep them current with the responsibilities and meeting expectations that would be of the organization to make sure we're training our people appropriately, for an annual cost of about $400 per person. So the costs are not necessarily a subtotal or a total at the end. We have to kind of talk about it as a per person and a fixed amount, which is more variable. So the hours of activity pay, based on the activity chart, we counted that the Special Police provided 1,293 hours at $25 an hour, gives you a subtotal of $32,325. We looked at uniform and equipment, where we believe it would cost about $2,000 to outfit somebody with that level of authority and title. And then annually, we figure it's about $400 with equipment and uniforms over a 5-year cycle to keep them current and replace them. We anticipated some of the back-end costs that come with the human resources and administrative costs of those positions. Because again, once they're paid employees, there's a lot of other costs associated with them other than hourly rate. So we ended up with the initial back-end cost from their onboarding and training, and then the annual back-end cost based on the training and activity pay. So for the paid peace officer position, we end up with a projected annual cost of $51,721 for training and activity. That doesn't account for any onboarding. Anybody that we onboard would be a per person rate of about $7,800. So that would be projected depending on what the turnover rate is and what the staffing level that's set by the board. And the bottom two options are the same concept, just broken out based on the lower dollar amount and reduced training requirement. You'll notice the annual hours is a little bit less. It's $100 less. What we looked at is one of the duties and activities that the Special Police had was the foot patrol at the carnival, where our focus going forward would be more traffic oriented and not associated with foot patrol. So we limited we eliminated that from the calculation to basically put it at 100 hours less annually. So we end up with respectively the $31,843 as an annual projected cost for the same services we provided previously, and initial onboarding cost of $874 per person, depending on turnover and retention rates. And then obviously for a volunteer option, it's essentially the uniforms and equipment, both initially and then prorated over like a 5-year cycle at $100 per person. So I know I'm talking fast, open to questions, just have the summary slides to talk about. Really what it comes down to is there's more challenges than solutions by the time we got to this point in our discussion. For the paid peace officer, there's civil service barriers that basically are identified by the fact that the only current civil service title that's appropriate would be retired peace or police officer. The cost is significant to have a paid peace officer. And then the risk versus need conversation of does the board feel the requirement of having those level of services or authority with this position going forward. And then for the paid non-peace officers, there is no appropriate civil service title. And we have a question of authority that we have to resolve to identify whether we can put people out there directing traffic and make sure that we're giving them appropriate authority and training to do so. And then the same thing applies to volunteer peace officers, or volunteer non-peace officers. So, I know there's a lot of information real quick. I was trying to meet my timeline here for the workshop, but anything you'd like to discuss or questions I can answer, please feel free.
Well, we're not going to short time on this just because we have 15 minutes. And I'm sure that since Councilman Cahill is leading the third agenda item tonight, he can probably truncate that down, right? No?
Take as long as you need.
Okay, yes, we're not going to. Chief, thank you. Great presentation, good slides. They're there for posterity. I'm sure they'll make their way to being posted so people can see them and absorb them a little bit more. Two things that I'd like to comment on or question, whatever, to start the Q&A or whatever is it. One, I think it was Tuesday we had our last meeting with the full group. Patty's been involved in this, like we said, back on March 13th. Chief, myself, Brayden Connor is our Director of Human Resources. And then the leadership of the past Special Police unit has been involved. Specifically, Mike Charlin, Joe Monachino, and Gene Coleman. And one of the things 2 days ago that we summed up was just the timeline since January 13th. One thing I felt pretty good about was that there was a good amount of meetings and a good amount of hours spent on this, both as a group of 7 of us. A lot of those discussions and meetings kind of led to these summaries. So I feel pretty good about the last 2 months as far as the effort put in to vet this. The second thing is, what Chief has shown here is the 3 options that we always were researching throughout this process. At the meeting 2 days ago, we talked about the 4th option. And the 4th option is somewhat shown in the first slide, is that, and I think you have in the columns, that the Webster Police Department could backfill these events with traffic control that are the annual events. And there's a cost associated with that and whatever. But we said that within that option, is that does there exist, because through the conversation, your dad's not here tonight,
No.
okay. But I know that Joe and Mike know this, is that is there an appetite to approach the state legislator government about, I'll call it changing the law that has basically led to this, Brayden, how would you describe it, Chief? They're oxymoronic, or there's just it's not structured where it makes any sense. They didn't have the foresight back when how would you describe it? Put you on the spot.
There's statutory conflicts that prevent the continuation of the prior service. And so that's led to the town board being in a situation that is untenable, and for the folks looking for a solution to having to choose from suboptimal choices. Every choice is suboptimal. And so, an arguably better solution would be to have the state legislature resolve the statutory conflicts that they've created over time.
And that's an easy process, right, Rick?
They can do that in a month.
Yeah, there's, I'm just a bill.
Yeah, I remember that for, School Loves Rock. Loved it.
Yes.
And the thing is, I think that throughout this process, the seven of us, the leadership of the past special police, we all agreed that, I think we were all unified in our belief that this is because there is that statutory conflict. So that is an option. All three of these things we can just, forget about, and for the time being, have the police department, and Dennis, you've shown how you can do that, backfill that service, and what the cost is. But I don't really, right now, on March 24th, we haven't done enough vetting to understand really how to approach the state government with this. And really, I'll use the term, is it an effort that is tantamount to swinging at windmills, that it'll never get through, because we just don't know how many of the other 920 towns and however many villages and whatever are really, like, this is a hot topic for them, that they really want to get this statutory conflict resolved, so we all live happily ever after with essentially the structure of the past special police, where it's peace officers and they're volunteer and they, and is that a good way to describe it, Chief? And I'm still somewhat of a rookie to this government thing, but I'm starting to figure it out a little bit that, as we would approach our state assembly person and our state senator to try to get some momentum on this, we would have to do some research to see, does this have a shot to get to first base, where there could be momentum built through the state assembly, through the state senate, where there would be an appetite for it at that level. We just haven't done that research yet. We made it to March 24th and we did what we said, but that kind of has come up in the last conversations, that, that is option 4. We just don't know. I couldn't even fathom who is the one that takes that baton and runs with it and is the project leader, who goes and does the research and all that to find out if it's a worthwhile effort. I don't know. And
I think it'd be reasonable to project, you're talking years like that.
I'm not even talking the time frame of, as you know, that this is a bill, not just a bill, whatever. The reality is, and I'm trying to think how to say this, that this is policing. This is law enforcement. I'm an idealist. I'd like to think that, that maybe the events of the last couple of years has opened the eyes to our government, our state government, to say, we need to start putting a little bit more respect and emphasis on law enforcement, law and order. I hope that happens. But I'm just saying the truth here, and people can, can agree to disagree with me. That is not what the state government has done the last couple of years. And so that's why I say, forget the time frame. Is there an appetite for the current legislator and how they're constructed, and the current Senate and how they're constructed, and the governor, how it's constructed, where they would say, this is something we really want to get behind? I don't know. So, that's the start of the Q&A, and really, Chief, there was no Q in there, was there? I'm done. I'll hand the time to the other board members.
I'd like to hear from you gentlemen what their position and your members' positions are with respect to these 3 options.
Yeah,
Well, if you're going to do that, now we don't have the podium set up, so where do we
I go
put,
there.
can you come over here, because I think camera-wise and all that, nicely played, Jen. But let's make sure that Joe can be seen at home live,
Can I get to sit down?
but also for posterity when people go back and look at the tape later.
Awesome.
Okay.
Well, my name is Joe Monachino. I've been with the former Special Police Unit for over 30 years. I was chief for over 10 years of that. I am currently a certified instructor, and I help assist in training other special police departments in the county. But I just have some comments. First of all, I want to thank the chief and the board and the supervisor for allowing the committee and myself, Mike, and Chief Holmeyer to be part of this to come up with solutions. I really appreciate that. We thank you for that. Well, one couple comments is, we think about the future, right? The future is very important, and I feel there's an opportunity here to make perhaps whatever this new unit will be or not be bigger, better, and stronger than it was before. Obviously, there's tremendous amount of savings by going to peace officer paid, right, compared to what it would cost an hourly wage to pay a police officer. We're not going to replace them. That's not, the intention, never was the intention. But, in the day and age that we live now with the emergencies and the threat of war, the Grenade nuclear power plant, all that, we need to build this unit, right, for the future of our town. And I think, depending on what options we go here, but a paid peace officer being one of them, that would help build that for the future at a reasonable cost, even by paying a peace officer. We continue to keep expenses down for public safety, and perhaps we can maybe in the future expand those services even more. And I'll give you an example. We're probably going back 5 or 6 years, maybe a little bit longer than that. We were asked to help with code enforcement. And we went out and we really checked every house and business in the town of Webster within, I think it was a week period. And we came back with almost a football field full of unregistered vehicles and people that had in their possession junk, so to speak, right? So we were able to do that, with no cost. But even if there is a paid component to it, it's a very reasonable. I think it's important to also remember to, if we can retain our current roster, right, we could maximize expertise and the training that they have, right? So I know we talked about 190 hours and the cost incurred for that. We have 15 members that have already gone through the majority of that training. So the initial startup cost would be zero for that. We're still considered certified peace officers, as the state sees us, and I think that's up to a period of 2 years. And one thing that I wanted is actually the last thing is that possible transfer to the Webster Police Department is a great advancement resource, right? So we have people that want to get into law enforcement. We're paying them to run the best behavior. What a great opportunity to get the best, the cream of the crop, and go into, full-time law enforcement position. For recruitment purposes and in the future, I think that is, an incredible advancement resource. That's all I really have. I know that, if you look at the financials, and I know we're going to look at all the different options in the board will, but I encourage you to look at those points that I mentioned. Still, even with a paid peace officer, the risks and all that stuff associated with it, the value is there. We had the risk before. There's always going to be risk. Now, as a new unit hopefully comes together, we'll still have those same risks with a cost, but still at a lot lower cost than, to employ the police department and pay them the overtime over the wage. So that's all I have. I want to continue to keep Webster Life worth living. Any questions?
Any questions for Joe? Thank you, Joe.
Thank you.
Thank you, Joe.
So I have a quick question for the chief, and this question was spawned by my driving by an intersection where there was a fire at the house, and there were volunteer firemen directing traffic, and they do that on a pretty regular basis, right? How does that compare to volunteer non-peace officer? Or is it not analogous whatsoever?
They actually don't relate. In theory, they do. I mean, it's the same concept, directed traffic, but the power that they use to to do that drives from a different place.
Okay.
So essentially, there's two components for firemen. I was actually just reading this today. There's two components for fire agencies to direct traffic. One is a authorized fire police squad that is established, pardon me, and they are actually listed in the CPL as when they are active at a fire scene. It's very specific authority during the time of the actual event. They're allowed to control traffic and direct traffic. The other one is that ultimately that responsibility falls to the fire chief, and the fire chief can delegate it to firefighters that aren't part of the special police squad in order to divert traffic at a fire scene. So it's very specific to fire scenes, and it's derived under the authority of the fire chief, essentially.
If it pleases you, I have one other element that goes along with that, and it goes to this issue of statutory conflict. Firefighters and fire police are covered by workers' comp law. There's specifically, even when they're volunteers, there's specific statute to cover them.
Okay.
And so the state legislature recognized that as a problem at some point and did something about it. And there's no analogous coverage for voluntary special police, which was one of the risk factors that had been previously identified.
Jenny?
Thanks, Tom.
Bill?
A lot to digest and review. We just did this today, so it's a lot to look at. I'm not seeing an outlet for our special police department.
Lot to digest and review. Well, I think that concludes that item tonight, but I also, I want to be cognizant and sensitive to the fact that I don't want to just leave it hanging in the air and say, well, we said we'd come back on the 24th, check the box, we came back on the 24th. That doesn't feel good because there's, as Councilman Abbott said, there's a lot to digest and review. So I'm not going to put out a date to come back to this, but I'm going to take your words, Bill, is that let's digest, let's review, and figure out soon coming back and maybe looking at this again. And I can't stress this enough, and I'll talk to Brayden and the crew about it, because it really just came to focus 2 days ago about what would it take to go to the state. And as you said, Jen, you can only assume how long that process would be. But like I said, I'm an idealist. You got an election coming up in November 22. The configuration of the Assembly, the Senate, and the governor could be very different.
Yes.
And from that standpoint, timing is everything. That could be a low-hanging fruit item for them, for a new configuration. I'm going to be very careful with my words, I guess. So, we'll be back. I just don't know when. I don't want to make any. It was easy to make the promise that in 60 days we should be able to put in some work, and we did. I feel good about that. I don't know what date to say we'll be back to after we absorb and all that, though.
I do have one more question, and you know, let me just say that, you know, I really appreciate all the hours that these gentlemen have put into this, and Patty also. My question is, under volunteer non-peace officer, questions of authority, how do we get some type of answer to that question, which is a very reasonable question? Or is it something that the town could establish through a local law? I'm asking the questions out of ignorance.
I would be answering out of ignorance. I don't know. I'd have to do some more research on that.
All right. I'd be interested in, hearing. And again, thank you for all.
And John, interesting enough, I have a meeting next week with Round Creek Town Supervisor Rory Fitzpatrick, and I think Chief, they had a contingent or that is a that is essentially our third there, volunteer non-police officer, is that correct?
Yeah, essentially. So I think there's some limitations on what they're allowed to do, because I think the ultimate conflict comes down to the ability to block traffic and redirect traffic is specifically listed as either a flag person or a police officer in the vehicle traffic law. And then the flag person is very specifically defined to construction, railroad, or escort vehicles. So, and that's where I don't know if the local law allows for exercising authority of the state vehicle traffic law. So that's part of the research that needs to be done, and I don't think Ironic quite crossed that bridge either. I believe that their police officers are the ones closing the road, and then they're staffing it or supplementing that with the volunteer activities. And again, it's a question of trying to get some position that has the authority to meet the needs that we're trying, which is traffic control, but also navigating some of the challenges that the only apparent authority currently right now doesn't fit what we're looking for, and that's the big difference.
Thanks, Chief. Okay. Well, that concludes that part of tonight's workshop.